The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
The Arctic is changing more rapidly than anywhere else on Earth due to climate change, and this is profoundly impacting the people that live and depend on the ecosystems in these cold regions. Jeff and I were just fascinated by how innovative nature-based solutions are being used in cold regions. So we just had to invite Laura Wendling, our guest on the previous episode, back to continue our conversation. Laura is a senior research scientist at SINTEF Community in Trondheim, Norway. Welcome to Season 7, Episode 13. Jeff King, lead of the Engineering with Nature program, and I are just delighted to welcome Laura back. Jeff, when we signed off Episode 12, you said you and Laura are kindred spirits.
Well, she certainly is. Laura, everything you said really resonates with me and what we're trying to do within the EWN program. In our previous episode, Episode 12, you shared a lot about your passion for integrating nature-based solutions into truly sustainable solutions to address the unique challenges of climate change in Arctic regions. And I was really intrigued by the innovation and how you and your colleagues are advancing this application of nature-based solutions. And so there's a lot we can learn, and I'm excited about this conversation today.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I'm happy to be back and really looking forward to continuing our conversation.
As am I. So welcome back, Laura. When we signed off our last episode, you were heading to the Gaia Arctic Summit, which was focused on how to accelerate the transition to climate resilience in the Arctic. We'd love to hear a little bit about your experience. Tell us about it.
Well, it was fantastic. So I've just returned to Trondheim from Gaia Arctic Summit in Vesterålen in Northern Norway, and I am feeling super inspired. It was fabulous from start to finish, and I have to say it's the first time I have ever been on a commercial flight where there were no assigned seats. It was a really tiny flight from Tromsø to Stokmarknes, but the landscape there is absolutely stunning, and I think seeing it really brought home how important it is that we protect this beautiful area and the people who live there.
Excellent. Tell us a little bit about the summit, what you talked about, what some of the key outtakes were.
Okay, so The Gaia Arctic Summit brought together actors from a lot of different dimensions, so policy, finance, business, research and innovation, public administration, to explore all these challenges that are associated with climate change in the Arctic. We had, I think, 3 different main sessions, but the main message for me, or what it boils down to, is the need to collaborate across disciplines in how we work every day. So not just having a meeting once a year, but how we work in our daily life and how we plan things. What we kind of, the overarching sort of summary was that we need everything. We need political will. We need robust policies. We need societal buy-in and the engagement of the business community to stimulate the innovation that's needed. But all of this needs to be underpinned by collaboratively defined visions of the future and evidence-based action plans. So there's a role for everyone, every sector in society, every person. It really just highlighted the need to work together towards our common goal, which is achieving climate resilience.
When we last spoke, you were preparing to talk to a bunch of finance people. So we're very and you were, I think, you were a little bit anxious about what you were going to talk to finance people about. We want to hear about how did that go? How did your session go?
Well, I moderated a session on finance, research, and innovation to catalyze change. And I was really intimidated because I'm not an expert in finance or business. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't say anything silly or ask dumb questions. But then it really occurred to me that most of the audience wasn't an expert in finance or in business or innovation. That we all had our own areas of expertise. So if I asked kind of an obvious question, that it was probably something at least one other person in the audience was thinking. So I tried to focus on things like how do we close the finance adaptation gap, and how does this specifically relate to the Arctic communities? And what about the urban-rural divide? Are we sure that everyone in our rural Arctic communities is sufficiently represented in decision-making? And how do we reach everyone in the community? Things like that. But we had fantastic conversations, and I had a wonderful panel.
That's great, Laura. I think all of those topics were really important that needed to be talked about. And I know here in the States, financing of nature-based solutions is a really big deal. And we spend a considerable amount of time talking about that as well. And also trying to identify case studies where we can find some really interesting ways that practitioners and local sponsors have been able to pursue the integration of nature-based solutions and finding those resources to make it happen.
Absolutely. And just bringing a bunch of people together that come at the challenges from different points of view, different disciplines. That's one of the things that we found through the Engineering with Nature program has been so critically important to really advance the whole science of engineering with nature and the application of nature-based solutions. I'm sure you saw that kind of thing as well, Laura, just that synergy when people come together.
Well, absolutely. I think it's like anything. When we come together and we bring our unique perspectives from whatever sector or discipline that we know, and the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. There was a really good example from a small startup company in Northern Norway that uses a byproduct from the aquaculture industry to produce a material similar to leather. And he was saying in our panel discussion that even having the conversation with the guys from the aquaculture industry, saying, I would like to have this waste material that you produce, and they just couldn't believe that anybody would want it. Why do you want this icky stuff? It's important to have these conversations and think outside the box and be willing to maybe look a little bit silly by asking questions that probably someone else already knows the answer to.
For sure. I think that's a really good segue to talk about what we want to talk about today on this episode. Jeff and I are really interested in hearing your thoughts on the policies and the challenges and really the opportunities that you see for further advancing nature-based solutions in cold regions. So in episode 12, you gave us several examples about how nature-based solutions are being integrated into long-term sustainable solutions. We wanted to go deeper on that. We wanted to explore some of the key policy frameworks, the scaffolding, if you will, for really incorporating nature-based solutions.
Yes. And so that scaffolding, better understanding the foundation by which you're approaching it, how we can learn from it. And then, Laura, maybe you could also start by talking a little bit about the European Green Deal and the EU's biodiversity strategy for 2030.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think the important thing to know is that the European policies are probably not as complex as they may seem from the outside. They're very well aligned with international agreements. So the European policy framework is designed to respond to or deliver or set specific goals that help us to deliver on international commitments and then obviously the European policy in itself. But very strongly aligned with things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Accord, Sendai Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, and Convention on Biological Diversity. So these are just a few examples. So you asked about the European Green Deal, and this is kind of an overarching piece of policy. It's a package of initiatives that are intended to direct the European Union in a green transition. So the goal is to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And it has a number of different elements. Some of the main elements here are clean and affordable energy supply, mobilizing industry for circular economy. There's a zero pollution ambition, farm to fork strategy for fair and environmentally friendly food systems, smart mobility, so accelerating the shift to sustainable and smart mobility, and finally preserving and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity. And all of this in the context of a socially equitable and just transition.
Well, Laura, that is indeed very impressive, and so pleased to hear all of the initiative and good work that's happening associated with the Green Deal.
Yeah, it's a huge piece of policy, and there's always ongoing work on it. So, for example, the biodiversity strategy for 2030 is a core part of this European Green Deal, and it's a long-term plan to protect our ecosystems and biodiversity with specific commitments and actions to be achieved by 2030. I don't know if you've heard much about the nature restoration law in the U.S., but this is a proposed component of the Green Deal that, if approved by the European Council, will include a commitment for EU countries to restore at least 30% of habitats in poor condition by 2030, I think 60% by 2040, and 90% by 2050. And this law has been adopted by the Parliament, but it's not yet passed the Council. And it's really important because more than 80% of the European habitats are currently in poor condition.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. So many interesting initiatives that are happening there in Europe. And to me, that's quite aggressive to be able to get to 90% restoration, and fantastic. I'm very hopeful that we'll see something like that actually take place, that'll be rooted in practice.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, it's very ambitious. And I think that there's always a gap between the ambition and achievement, but it puts us on the right track and it sets the right targets. It's science-based, it's evidence-based, which is a fundamental aspect of the European research and innovation strategy, is that we produce science and evidence to support good policy.
So it sounds like the framework is very comprehensive, and the ambitions, as you call them, are very clearly delineated, Laura. Can you talk about, and to Jeff's point, I mean, that's very ambitious. Can you talk about some of the gaps between the policy and the vision and, what's happening on the ground today?
Sure. I guess my own perspective is somewhat limited because I don't work in the public sector, but my work with the public sector has given me a little bit of insight. So what I see is that the policies, European level policies, provide an excellent framework for action, and we're making really good progress in addressing science policy gaps and raising public awareness through, targeted research and innovation efforts. But there are still some challenges in vertical and horizontal policy alignment, particularly at the local level. And a lot of the local actors, so municipalities or even regions, have mentioned that there's an awful lot of policy that has to all be implemented at the same time, and that it needs to align. So there is some question as to how well we're able to align local policy with regional, national, European policy, and then how well we're actually delivering on the ground. So to me, this represents the gap and begs the question whether we have all the necessary tools to implement these multi-level policies, and if not, how do we address it?
Laura, I was going to ask, so in terms of public perception and their interest in seeing something like this be adopted and actually supporting these steps needed to get to this very ambitious goal, what's the sense of like the public's interest in seeing something like this actually be adopted?
Oh gosh, that's actually a really hard question. I think it probably depends on who you ask. And of course, most of the people that I know are very supportive of the targets, the goals that have been outlined. But it's because that's a community of actors that I know well. I know that there are some concerns, particularly amongst, say, the primary producers, the farming community, with regard to the nature restoration law and what that might mean for food production and food security.
Right.
How might it change our practices? So I think that's a major stumbling block right now with the council. But like I said, it depends very much who you're talking to.
You know, one of the things that we've talked a lot about on this podcast is the importance of engaging all the stakeholders in meaningful engagement. And that's so critical to creating and moving forward on actions. And there's great uncertainty in some of the requirements for the future.
That's right. And Laura, you're not alone. And certainly what you just described is something we see quite a bit on our end too. And even those individuals or organizations that are receptive to the idea of nature-based solutions still have their own set of policies or rules or regulations that they must adhere to. And sometimes those can be contrary to the overall goal of having nature-based solutions be integrated into a landscape. So that habitat trade-off kind of concern always comes up for us, regardless of what region you're working at in the country. And then certainly we have those local stakeholders where perhaps you have one group that is really leaning into this and very supportive, but perhaps there's others that have another sort of position or thinking through, how this might affect certain other resources or, as you indicated, certain economic drivers. And we have to find that common ground. We have to be able to, in many ways, highlight the value of nature-based solutions and the value of nature and what that means for local economies and to be able to think about sustainability and resilience.
Yeah, I agree. I think this brings up a really, really important point about how do we value nature? Because as you say, Jeff, there's always a trade-off.
Yes.
Whether we're working in rural areas where we're saying that we have this goal to preserve or protect a certain percentage of the natural capital by 2030, or we're working in urban areas where we want to renature our cities, we're talking about land use. And sometimes we're talking about changing land use. But every time we dedicate land to any particular use, then we have opportunity costs. Mm-hmm. So there's a big question in cities about greening versus densification. So we want our cities to be compact and walkable. We want one to be dense so that we don't have urban sprawl and lots of emissions associated with transport. At the same time, we want to have green space in our cities.
That's right.
And this is something that is contentious at times.
We're seeing the same thing in North America. And we also want to reduce transportation, especially cars, into cities. But meanwhile, we're densifying cities, and it goes on and on. We want to talk, Laura, about some of the things that you're seeing in the Arctic, particularly in terms of the gaps between different values, different priorities, and how that's being worked through.
Now that's actually a little bit tricky, and it's an interesting question. One of the things that I noted at this recent Gaia Arctic Summit is that the summit organizer was talking about how the Gaia Arctic Summit had been blocked or was banned on Facebook because it had been reported by the local people kept reporting it as inappropriate content. So there was some public backlash to having a conference on climate change in the Arctic amongst that particular community. And it really surprised me because we read all the time about how climate change is pronounced in the Arctic. It's, warming at 3 times the rate of the rest of the world. And there are all these significant impacts. And I was taken aback, I guess, that the local community wasn't fully on board. And then I realized that when we don't understand or when we're approaching something from a place of fear, it's frequently then just an outright rejection. If for example, we're not able to provide solutions, then it's scary to think that there are these changes that are here or that are coming. So to me, this really highlights how critical, how essential it is that we have this full engagement of the community, that we're working to provide solutions that are cross-sectoral, and that we really understand needs and desires of the community, and it's not imposing something top down, but really working from bottom up. And I think that is where nature-based solutions can be really powerful.
Indeed. Yes, Laura. And I feel like, you set it up nicely there in terms of that fear and how we must be able to educate and be able to offer information to everybody. There has to be some type of common denominator here in which we are able to approach just the general public to be able to share more information on what we are striving for in the way of this nature prioritization and being able to create these more sustainable landscapes and communities that I think we all can really appreciate and be comfortable in long term, given all the other stressors that are out there for us. And this geopolitical context that we seem to be sort of dancing around here, certainly where we live, they're very different. The challenges are very different. And I'd like to maybe share that I think we within the United States share some of those challenges as well. And I know that that's ubiquitous all around the world. There's those same similar kinds of challenges that exist. When we were preparing for this episode, we started talking a little bit about that urban-rural divide. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit for us too and offer some comparisons or maybe contrast what it is you're seeing as well.
Sure. I guess when I think about the urban-rural divide, what I note is that here in Europe, most of our natural capital, so our natural areas, our forests and farmlands are in rural areas. And yet a lot of the decisions about how that natural capital is managed seem to come more from urban community. So we tend to view rural populations as the stewards of this land. I think it's so important that we're able to value that natural capital. Like you were saying earlier, Jeff, that if we understand what the value is, then I think it's easier to develop a strategy for the management that compensates non-exploitation, if that's the choice that's made. But you also mentioned this geopolitical issues. In the Arctic, I think this is particularly evident where we see the sea ice dissolving, so less sea ice and opening up these new transport routes and revealing previously unknown mineral resources. There's all sorts of development possibilities here. How do we ensure that the Arctic is developing in a way that's consistent with the needs and desires of the local populations?
I think that's a $60,000 question, Laura. And, it really makes me wonder, it really makes me wonder about how the values and the voices of the Indigenous people in the North are being heard and being considered in decision-making. To what degree are they being brought in to co-create solutions and to really co-create a vision for the future? I've certainly seen some big disconnects in the Canadian North between the values and priorities of some of the Indigenous groups and some of the proposed developments, including, mining developments in the Ring of Fire.
I guess I can't speak to that in general or make generalizations about the European Arctic and compare, but I do know that there's been quite concerted effort for a long time to ensure that the voices of Indigenous and local communities are heard and that Indigenous and local knowledge is exploited in developing solutions for the future. So it's an ongoing effort, and I think we can always do better. But that's true not only in the Arctic, but anywhere, making sure that we're really getting fully representative stakeholders or hearing everyone's voice when we make a decision.
And Laura, maybe just to echo what you're saying and maybe share a little bit of good news with our listeners. I've obviously been working in this space for quite some time, but in more recent months, we've actually seen a lot of movement in this direction. So, for example, with the Corps of Engineers, there's now this principles, requirements, and guidelines update that has been made for our planning process. And it's a wonderful movement in terms of seeing more value being placed on nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure, to the point that now within the Corps, we will be taking a closer look at what we call other social effects associated with our projects. So where might we see recreational benefits being derived from some of our flood risk reduction type projects? Just to give you an example, environmental effects now will be also weighted more equitably with, say, some of the other national economic development accounts that we traditionally have used to gauge the value of a project. And then what I'm really excited about is in these agency-related guidelines that are being released, we now see recognition of traditional ecological knowledge and the importance of working with these First Nations to be able to identify, what is it that they value? What kind of perspectives and insights might they have for how we can create resilience, and how can we bring some of those natural processes into some of these projects that the Corps has historically approached and perhaps hasn't really thought about it. So really good news on my end, and I think that we're going to see more and more of that happening.
I certainly hope so. And I think that just makes a lot of sense. When we talk about incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, like, why haven't we been doing it always? Or have we been doing it? I don't know. I figure that everybody on Earth knows something I don't. And so I want to learn from everyone. So to me, it's just sense. But I also think, and I love nature-based solutions. I think that this is really what makes nature-based solutions so powerful, is that we want to engage the full range of stakeholders, everybody who affects or is affected by whatever sort of intervention we're making. And whether it's a only nature-based solution or it's a hybrid solution that is somehow connected with our engineered infrastructure, it's all about finding a solution that's workable for the community. Everything
That's
from...
So true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But I think, it starts even just from identifying the problem, because we can sit outside, as engineers and scientists and politicians and say, oh, well, here's the problem, but we don't necessarily live there. We don't experience it. So I think we have to start from problem definition and then defining what our vision for the future. What does it look like? And it may be a little bit different than what we initially thought.
That's
right. So true. And certainly point. We've seen that in so many examples, Laura, that you really need to start at the beginning to build shared understanding of what the problem is, but also what the opportunity is. And then hear the different values of people around the table. I think that's a really, really important message. I want to jump back to something that you talked about a little bit earlier about some of the challenges and some of the gaps in the urban landscape. I know that in your work now, you're really focused on the water side. Talk a little bit about what are some of the gaps you're seeing and what are you going to be working on?
I would say that probably most of, or a lot of, the nature-based solutions work that's been done to date has focused on managing water. And this is because it was sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will. Water management is critical. I think that it's still the leading cause of leading economic loss due to climate change across Europe. I read a figure recently, something like 75 billion euros in 2021 alone, perhaps. Don't quote me on the value, but I mean, it's an immense amount of money that economic loss due to flooding from climate, extreme events due to climate change. So nature-based solutions focused on stormwater management in particular were some of the very first to be implemented. And it's an area where I've worked and I will probably continue to work as long as we have more intense rainfall, more frequent extreme events.
Well, Laura, I'm curious now, and I've been following your work now, and know that you have a a lot of different irons in the fire. You are a very busy person. You're out there doing a lot of different things out there, and all of it fascinating to me. But just curious, if you had to pick only one area that you were going to focus on and work in, and I'm not saying you should. I think you should continue to do exactly what you're doing and be in many different places. But if you had to pick one, what is the one place, one element of your existing research portfolio that you would just say, you know, Jeff, this is where I would spend my time if I were only restricted to this one thing?
Oh man, that is a tough question, and I would probably say renaturing, and because that gives me a kind of a broader scope.
Trick question, and you solved it. Okay.
Yeah. No, but I like what you said earlier about having multifunctional green spaces, and I think it's really important in areas that have been degraded that when we talk about renaturing or restoring ecological integrity and biodiversity, that we also consider that there are many different benefits that we can achieve. And again, this is going back to, I guess, the concept of nature-based solutions is you have multiple co-benefits equally across social, economic, and environmental pillars. But if we're designing a green space that, for example, like we did in the city of Tampere, where we designed a green space that would retain water during major flood events. So we had an alluvial meadow. It was, mind you, it was at the cost of a football pitch, so like a soccer field. So instead we had an alluvial meadow. But what it did was it prevented the local homes and school from flooding whenever there was an extreme event where the water was the volume of water was too much to be retained entirely within the stormwater ponds. So we have this benefit of reduced flooding, but we also have a nice recreational area where people can go when it's dry and recreate in the park.
Very nice.
And Laura, just for my understanding, renaturing is actually a policy, isn't it?
Well, it is. So there's urban nature plans that are part of the biodiversity strategy to 2030. And it's quite interesting because when this was announced, the biodiversity strategy to 2030 required every city of more than 20,000 inhabitants to come up with, they called it an urban greening plan. And this has since been renamed to Urban Nature Plan. And there's now a platform to help cities come up with a plan for renaturing, and it includes all these different steps that roughly follow the same sort of process that we do for nature-based solutions in general. So to me, it's all very intuitive and very clear, and I hope it's intuitive and clear to all the other end users. But ultimately, the goal is to reintroduce nature to our cities, reconnect our structural and functional connectivity of habitats so that wildlife in our cities can move and adapt to climate change. And we have plenty of habitat for different species. So I think we tend to think a lot about things like birds and bats and pollinators, bees, butterflies in cities. But there are, of course, other wildlife that coexist with us in our urban areas. And hydrologic connectivity, because I love water, so important because without water, we can't have anything.
And we also have to think about the nature benefits to people.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of evidence about the benefits of spending time in nature, for our health and well-being. So it's not only getting out and being physically active, but how it makes us feel,
Yes.
our mental health.
Jeff and I are big proponents of that.
That's right. That's right.
Absolutely.
We're all very agreeable.
Yeah. I guess I'm preaching to the choir today.
We're agreeable. And we read the book. We read Florence Williams' book, The Nature Fix. We're believers in the science of health and well-being and being out in the forest. Laura, before we let you go, we need to talk to you about what you're going to be working on what's ahead for you for the rest of this year and maybe a little bit beyond?
Well, I think it's basically what we've been talking about. I mean, my work will continue as it has been broadly in the field of nature-based solutions and targeting whatever the really locally urgent issues are with the stakeholders that I work with. And I'm quite keen to continue the work in the Arctic, working with Arctic communities to develop greater climate resilience because the action is needed urgently.
Well, Laura, I hope that our paths will continue to cross. I know that within the Army's Engineering Research and Development Center, our Cold Regions Research Engineering Lab, we are continuing to move out on prioritization of nature-based solutions and looking at opportunities for integrating those concepts, those projects into our Arctic communities and continuing to be able to support those First Nations that live in Alaska. And the international component, the international collaboration, that's something too that I want to see EWN continue to engage with and support. So I'm very optimistic that somewhere down the road, you and I will have a chance to do a little bit more in this realm of collaboration.
I completely agree. And I think it's so important that not only you and I, but the research communities that we work within work together.
Hear, hear.
We need to learn from each other because I think, and actually I would ask everybody listening, all of our listeners, our global community, to think about a consolidated action plan to engage the full range of stakeholders and move across borders to address the issues of climate change because climate change doesn't stop at borders. We all have to work together. Only global action is going to have the outcome that we all need.
Well said, Laura. And we always try to ask our guest about their call to action, but boy, I tell you, that sounded an awful lot like a call to action to me. What do you think, Sarah?
I think that's a pretty strong call to action. And, Laura, everything you've talked about really speaks to the need for collaboration and learning and cross-cultural learning, but also the urgency to get on with it, to be moving forward on a focused plan. So it's just been fantastic to have you back. It's been our pleasure to have you as our guest on the Engineering with Nature podcast. And we really thank you for sharing your insight and how nature-based solutions are really playing such an important role in the urgent climate change adaptation underway in northern regions. And I think, Jeff, Laura's really challenged us. She's given us a lot of things to think about.
Oh, indeed. Yeah, lots of good information here, and I know it's going to really resonate with our listeners. And I've been taking notes, and I certainly want to make sure that I go back and have a chance to process everything that Laura's been talking with us about today. I just really appreciate so much, Laura, you spending this time with us and helping our listeners better understand the many different facets of your work and then also how it can be applied and what we need to be thinking about globally.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jeff and Sarah. I am absolutely delighted to talk about nature-based solutions anytime, anywhere, but especially with colleagues who share some of the same ambitions and viewpoints that I do. Like I said, I think that the opportunity to collaborate widely outside our own sector and outside our comfort zone is really important, and we should all be taking every opportunity so that we can accelerate our action on climate change.
That's right.
Absolutely. And Laura, it's wonderful for Jeff and I to have a kindred spirit in Norway. We know where you are. We know how to get a hold of you. And Jeff, hey, what a perfect way to wrap up season 7.
Oh, yes. I've enjoyed this so much and so many wonderful pieces of information to share. And I think back on everything that we did in season 7 and just a real testimony to all the wonderful things that are happening out there. And Laura, you helped us put a nice little bow on this season. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a safe and very happy summer. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you'll join us again in Season 8 as we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by iContact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.